Yeah, good afternoon, friends. It's great to have you here this afternoon at SILA. Great to have friends of Tim and colleagues from Wycliffe here, so warm welcome. Also to our friends who are online. We've got some people who are on the Zoom as well, in far-flung places like Brisbane, at least, so that's exciting to see. My name is Graham Scott. I'm the CEO of SILA Australia. In short, perhaps, SILA Australia would describe ourselves as a community development organisation with our focus in language. And so working alongside communities to see them flourish in the languages they value the most. And it's been our pleasure the last couple of years to have Dr. Tim Lewis here with us as our scholar in residence. It's been a really great fit. This is now Tim's fourth lecture today in Matthew, and stemming from his PhD work on the poetics of Matthew 1. And Tim's hermeneutic, the way he reads the text, the attention to detail in the text, and that the text, there is answers for understanding the text are in the text, are right there, surprisingly, or not surprisingly. That way of reading the text has, I think, really great parallels and resonates well with how we in SIL think about language and talk about texts, including the biblical text. So it's been a great fit. And today, as I said, today's the fourth lecture Tim has given in Matthew. And today I need to check the title because it's got several nouns. I'll get them in the wrong order. Logs, pearls, doors, and the golden rule. So we're looking out for logs, doors, pearls, logs, pearls, doors, and the golden rule in Matthew chapter 7. So I'll hand it over to Tim, and you'll break in the middle. What do you think?
Well, we'll have the questions scattered after each section,
yep. Okay.
So we won't have an official break.
Okay. So we'll have questions as we go. When it's question time, maybe just put your hand up, and we'll move the mic around so that people on Zoom can also hear what you're saying. Thank you very much. Maybe I should open in prayer as we start, okay? Let me pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this place, this beautiful place, and the chance that we had to gather this afternoon. Thank you for the guests, our guests who've come, our friends who've come. We ask, Lord, that you bless them. Lord, bless Tim. Give him clarity of thought and speech as he shares from your word. Lord, may what we learn today from Matthew 7, may that stir things in us, help us to think about points of application in our own contexts. And Lord, where you are nudging us along, we ask, Lord, that you'll use this time, Lord, to encourage us and to challenge us and to build us up as the body of Christ. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, Tim.
Don't have. All right, the text we'll be studying today is Matthew 7, verses 1 to 12. Don't judge so that you'll not be judged, because you'll be judged by the judgment by which you judge. By the measure you measure, it will be measured back to you. How can you see the speck that is in your neighbour's eye and not notice the log in your own eye? How can you say to your neighbour, "Allow me to take out the speck from your eye," but there is a log in your own eye? Hypocrite, take out the log from your eye first, and then you'll be able to see clearly to remove the speck from your neighbour's eye. Do not give the holy thing to dogs. Do not put your pearls in front of pigs, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and attack you. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. Because everyone who asks receives, and who seeks finds, and for the one who knocks it will be opened. Is there any person here who, when his son asks for bread, would instead give him a stone, or asks for a fish, and instead would give him a snake? So even though being evil, you know how to give good gifts to your children. How much more so your Father in the heavens will give good things to those who ask him. So then, the things that you wish people would do to you, do those same things to them, because that is the law and the prophets. These four teachings are often treated separately. And so today I'd like to think about not treating them separately, but thinking of them as a group. Sometimes they're treated loosely as a group, like a miscellaneous group, but we'll be looking for the links between these. And of course, we can study each one separately, and that should help us to start to notice the similarities between them and how they might be building on each other, and studying them in their immediate context. That's the hermeneutical loop, which hopefully will just keep going and going. So any ideas so far on what links, what connections there might be between these four sayings? Apart from the fact that they're all in Matthew. Well, they all sound like they're proverbs. And some good linguistic evidence, the best kind, that'll show that we're on the right track by thinking of these as a group. The first and the fourth refer to something that is done back to you, the same thing done back to you. And the middle two refer to something being given to, something good that is given to. So let's dive into the first one. Refrain from judging so you'll not be judged, because by the judgment you judge, you'll be judged. By the dish you dish out, it will be dished back to you. How can you see the speck in your neighbour's eye, but the beam in your eye you don't notice? How can you say to your neighbour, let me take out the speck from your eye, and look, the beam is in your eye? Hypocrita, first take the beam out of your eye, and then you will see clearly for taking out the speck from your neighbour's eye. So a good question to ask here, very basic question, who is doing the judging or the critiquing?
Do you want us to answer, or do you want...
People can call out if they're confident, and that's fine.
Yeah, you are.
Yes.
Yeah, we are.
So whoever's listening to this, we are the you. What about in the other part? There's two parts. So don't judge ye not, and then the second part, you'll not be judged. Who's doing the judging in that part? That's usually that's the common answer, that we all assume it must be referring to God. There's no reference to God in this part. So it could just be referring to other people.
Yeah.
So it comes back. What goes around comes around. In fact, there's a few parables, proverbs that we have. People in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. You reap what you sow. What goes around comes around. A taste of your own medicine. The chickens coming home to roost. The pot calling the kettle black. And in all of these proverbs, it's not really focusing on a particular avenger or a particular person who's doing the judgment back again. That's just the situation that's developed. You sort of have created a situation that does that. So generating your own consequences. In fact, there's Old Testament precedents where the classic example is when the prophet Nathan confronts David, and he uses a proverb, and David's getting very angry at this man in the proverb, in the parable. And at this point, David's anger rose against the man in the parable, saying, "By the life of the Lord God, this man is a dead man." And then David's calling for what needs to be done. And then Nathan says, "David, you are that man." We'll also have a few proverbs. "They who have rejected wisdom shall eat from the fruit of their way. They shall be sated from their own schemes. Those who are unkind bring about their own ruin. He who sows injustice will reap calamity. He who digs a trap will fall into it himself. He who rolls a stone upon himself, it will roll back." And later on in Matthew, we have those who take up the sword will die by the sword. Now, it's a very basic two-part pattern that we've got, and I think the pattern follows all the way through. So the first line is quite clear. Refrain from judging, and then the consequence, the effect to prevent is so you'll not be judged. And we've got the same pattern that keeps going. Because by the judgment you judge, you'll be judged. By the dish you dish out, it will be dished back to you. How can you see the speck in your neighbour's eye? So seeing a speck is an action. We might think of seeing as passive, but this is an action. And what's the effect? There's something wrong here with the effect. So I'm not going to highlight it as an effect because it's just, there's a glitch here. But the beam in your eye you don't notice? How can you say to your neighbour, "Let me take the speck from your eye," and look, the beam is in your eye? So there's that glitch again. Hypocrita, first take the beam out of your eye, and then you'll see clearly. So here we have the appropriate effect that is not illogical. So those other two parts, they're ludicrous effects. They're illogical.
Tim, the Greek hypocrita, is that the basis of hypocrite?
Yes, so that's what we usually translate as hypocrite, although it's not really a translation because it's just following the sound of the word. So there is a question about how to translate it, which I'll get to soon. What I'd like to do is to think about the person that doesn't normally get mentioned here, which is the person with the speck, and what is their response. So if we can role play, if we can all stand up, and instead of, I don't want you to practice on each other because I don't want you accusing each other of having eye problems. So you can, first of all, practice on me. So if you can say it to, I'll be the person with the speck, and if you can all say, "Let me take the speck from your eye."
Let me take the speck from your eye.
Okay. So I can think about how I feel about that. And now we'll swap it around. So I'll be saying it to you. I'll treat you all as one person. Let me take the speck out of your eye. So what's your response? So if we're thinking about the person with the speck, the natural response is, oh, everyone can sit down. The natural response is laughter. It's just ridiculous. You want to remove it? I'm pretty sure you're not qualified. look at your own eye. So that's kind of all assumed in our passage. So we've been working on the literal level. What about what's the metaphor mean? Because it's not talking about eyes and logs and specks. What's it talking about? So a few verses earlier we had the eye metaphor of the good eye and the bad eye. And so a clear eye was a guiding light. It was guiding the body. So it was about motivation, motives, having pure motives. And so it seems here that this is also the case. We've got a passage that's talking about motives and motivations. And speaking of what drives someone and motivations, I have a car driving story that I keep getting reminded of. When I'm studying this passage, I keep getting reminded of how sometimes when I'm driving, it's probably because I don't really enjoy driving and I resent it a little bit, but occasionally I find that if there's someone who's doing a little bit the wrong thing, like they're taking too long, or they should have waited for me and they've pulled out in front, or and I slow down, I make allowances for that person, and I really think, oh, they need to know how much I'm making allowances for them. I shouldn't drive extremely safely. I should just slow down a little bit so that there's like a near collision. and then they will know. Then they will know how gracious I am. So yeah, that occasionally happens, and I'm thinking I think this is the story that we have here, where it's the eyes, the motivations. So in pointing out somebody else's impure motivations, or they've made a wrong decision, or they're not motivated properly. What's it saying about my motivations in pointing it out? There's something that has been baffling me a little bit, and it wasn't until about 2 days ago that I think it makes sense now. But this word hypocrites is it's the standard word for actor in the first century, and it has been used in the previous chapter a few times when Jesus says, "Don't be like the stage actors who do their deeds as if they're performing on display in front of everyone." You can do the same deeds, but you don't have to do it like a publicity stunt. And so stage actor worked quite well in chapter 6, but every time I tried to translate it as stage actor in chapter 7, I thought, yeah, but hypocrite tends to work better. It's not exactly the same as we use the word hypocrite in English, but there is still some inconsistency, some illogical inconsistency. And so I was trying to figure out, well, is there a way of translating it the same? In chapter 6, don't be like the stage actors. Here, oh, you hypocrite, oh, you stage actor. What else could we, how else could we think of it? So I was thinking about how if a stage actor is there for themselves, for the glory, they're in it for the glory. It's about the public image, they're showing off. Is Jesus saying in chapter 7, you're showing off? Unless it's ironic, you're showing off, you're inadvertently showing off, but you're not aware that what you're showing is showing. And so it was sort of working. And then, I don't know why I didn't really think about this earlier, but if we're thinking about the impure motives, yes, that works. We've got, being up on stage, that sort of works. And then I realised the word itself is the same stem as what the passage started with. So you shall not judge, or you shall not don't criticize. Criticize is another one. In fact, the word criticize comes from the originally sort of way along the line. It's got the same bit of stem as the krino word. So there's a whole lot of so the Greek me krinete hina me krithete enogar krimate krinete krithesis there. You can see all the kri words there. And there's lots of kri stem words in Greek that are all about critiquing. Krino, krites, krisis, kritikos, all an assessment that is being made. So I think this is not an accident. I think that Jesus is being quoted here by Matthew as using a word that means critic, but not like a proper critic, just an actor critic. And after pondering this quite a lot about what's going on, because the actor critic, when Jesus says you actor critic, it's right after that line, let me take out the speck. And actors are about giving lines. And in the first century, actors didn't wear the makeup on their faces. The makeup went on the mask, so they wore a mask with these big exaggerated pictures. And so it does seem quite entertaining, like Jesus is saying, that's, you look funny, that this is very entertaining. You've got this very exaggerated look. But yeah, after pondering this quite a lot, I thought of this question again, well, who is judging? And I realized, who's doing the critiquing here? It's Jesus. Jesus is speaking, because we didn't get to hear from the person with the speck, but we do, because when Jesus says it, that's the response. That the person who's just being criticised would say, look at your own eye. So Jesus is giving the assessment. So Jesus is offering an assessment or a critique or a judgment. So I thought there's quite a lot of emphasis on this idea of making an assessment in this first passage. So here's a concluding way of translating it. Refrain from criticising someone, lest you be criticised, because the same critique you use will be used on you. The same serving that you serve is going to be served back to you. How can you identify a tiny impurity in your neighbour's motives, but not notice your own structural issues sticking out for all to see? How can you say, I have the answer to your issue, I can fix your impairment, when, look at yourself. You've got a huge structural problem of your own showing. Hey, critic, work on your own problem first. Then you'll be able to approach the other person with pure motives, and you'll see that fixing their eye is not your issue. Yeah, so Jesus tells a proverb that is confronting us with our own impure motives by telling a proverb in which the other person will find it difficult not to laugh at the exaggerated mask on the actor critic's face. So we can have a few questions now at the end of part one.
Right, so it's question time now. If you have a question, you're in the room, put your hand up and Jack will ring you the mic. If you're on Zoom, put your question in the chat box and I'll listen.
I guess it's okay if there are...
I've got a question.
Yes.
So could we use critic in the previous Matthew section where...
in Matthew 6.
Yeah.
He is critic there, and Jesus says, don't be like the hypocrites, don't be like the critics. I think actor critic, don't be like the actor critics. I think they're the emphasis was more on the stage aspect, and here the emphasis is more on what it looks like when you're on stage, rather than being on stage. So I don't know how to quite get it to work using. We could try and translate it actor critic, but I feel like it loses its. I think it loses its meaning there for some reason. So I haven't succeeded in finding the same word for both.
Thanks, Tim. You seem to be talking about the motives of the person who is doing the criticising. Can you talk a bit more about that?
The motives, yeah, I think the I represents someone's motivations. So when it says, how can you see, it's kind of, it can be read as two ways. Well, how you can't see. If you've got impure motives, you can't tell, you're not the person to be able to know what's going on with the other person's motives. But yeah, also, even if you are seeing it, the fact that you're looking for it and pointing it out is reflecting impure motives.
Thank you.
Is there a place for calling things out?
Yeah, well, I think it leaves it open at the end as to what happens once you realise that you've got to work on your own issue first, working on your own motivation. If you can manage to get it completely pure, then you can see what needs to be done, but it doesn't really, this passage doesn't really say what do you do? Are you actually the one who's going to do anything about it? It says, the more literal one is, then you will see clearly for removing your neighbour's speck. But that just shows that you can see it. It's not really clear whether you're the one to do it. But I guess if you do have pure motives, then you would approach it differently. So you wouldn't point it out and say, I'm the solution to your problem. So if you did want to approach the person, it would be done with pure motives, it would be done differently.
Thank you for your question, because I was just thinking Jesus is looking a little hypocritical doing the thing that is saying for us not to do by pointing it out. So Jesus' motives must be very pure, which we presume, but...
Yeah, we presume that Jesus has pure motives and his intention is, to help us to be able to see ourselves.
Yeah, and the other thing that it reminds me of people who've done work on themselves, there's a humility, like people have been through whatever, an AA program, whatever it is, and when they come and help, they're coming from an equal space of, been there, and it's not I think my problem with judging is the above position rather than the across position.
Yeah.
And so how humble would Jesus be for the person to experience Jesus as coming from the across rather than the above position? Like, I could understand why it would take Jesus 30 years before he started his ministry, because there would be a lot of things to get sorted out in himself before, so that he could say this.
Yeah, well, I think this is mainly about self-awareness. How do you become more self-aware, which takes a lot of knowing yourself, self-work, and also thinking, how do I come across to others? Yeah, I like your point. Shall we move to the next, or is there more?
Oh, it's just.
Yep, that's good.
It's just a clarifying question. The question from before, who's doing the judging, and then at the end you said it's Jesus. Is that what you said?
I'm
Did I
saying,
blank out?
I'm saying the implication is it's not really clear that there is anyone doing the judging. On the literal, there's no pronoun or anything in the passage, and so it's self-generated judgment that is assumed. But from a meta perspective, when we're looking at who is saying this passage, then Jesus is speaking. He's putting words into assessing what does it look like from the person who's not judging. What does it look like from Jesus' perspective, which is what we all are wanting to know. What does it look like when we have impure motives? Which the whole passage becomes then Jesus giving a critique of this issue. So we might continue. Don't give something holy to dogs. Don't place your pearls in front of pigs, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and attack you. It seems quite a different kind of saying. And it's much shorter. And that's all we've got to work with. And it's speaking of dogs and pigs, but it's not speaking of dogs and pigs. So again, we have a metaphor. It's not veterinarian advice about what not to feed dogs and pigs. And I wonder if any people would have thought that that's what it was. I doubt it. I think unless you're a child, perhaps, you can imagine a parent having to tell a child, don't give the pearls to the dog. Like, literally, it doesn't, like, literally, I don't think people would really need to be taught, there's no one probably thinking, hey, let's let some wild dogs into the temple to run riot and eat the holy food that the priests are only supposed to eat. I don't think people would need to be told this advice, which assumes that it means something different to what the literal is. So why is Jesus saying to avoid giving something good? According to the literal level, what's the answer to that question? So we've got 4 parts. The first 2 parts are very parallel. Don't give something holy to dogs. Don't put pearls in front of pigs. And the second 2 parts are both the negative consequences that might happen otherwise. Otherwise, they might trample them under their feet, which is not very appreciating of the gift, and turn and attack you. So Jesus is advising to be aware of potential hostility. People who may, presumably it's talking about people, not dogs and pigs. Those who may trample on what you've given and potentially harm you. So again, we've got a similar pattern where we've got this cause and effect happening, and both the first one and the first proverb and the second proverb were about how to avoid negative consequences coming back upon yourself. And both of them have some kind of inappropriate giving. So the first one was giving advice, uncalled for advice. In fact, it was negative. It was, let me take away something from you, which is the same Greek word that is used for banishing an unclean spirit. Let me take something from you. So it was an inappropriate kind of giving. And this one, you've got something good that you could give, and we're still told, don't give that. So in this case, we're expected to make a critical assessment of the recipient. That's not an appropriate recipient. So previously, a self-assessment was a lot about self-assessment, being aware of oneself, and this one is about assessing others and being aware of harm from others. So if we start tabling some of these similarities, we've got cause and effect for both of the first two, avoiding negative consequences to yourself, and then we've got someone giving, something given, and someone receiving. And we also have something from everyday wisdom that is being offered for more than just the everyday wisdom. There's something that can be extrapolated and expanded from. So how do we know how to apply this saying? It doesn't give us many hints as to an application. How do we know what we are being advised to do? So this is a proverb that's expecting listeners to figure it out for themselves, to imagine a situation that is not about literal dogs and pigs. In other words, they have to use discernment in order to understand how to apply it. So at the literal level, be wise about hostile dogs and pigs, which everyone already knows. They don't need to be told that. So metaphorically, being wise about particular relationships. In other words, to use wisdom to generate more wisdom. And I really like this proverb, Proverbs 4:7. The beginning of wisdom is get wisdom. After that, with everything you've got, get understanding. And so it seems very cyclical. Using wisdom to increase wisdom. Proverbs 9:9a. Give to a wise person and they will become more wise. Now this helps very much with a passage later on in Matthew which has always stumped me. I've always been baffled by Matthew 13:12 and Matthew 25:29. The one who has will gain more and will eventually have a lot. The one who has not will not even be able to hold on to what they have and will lose everything. So the one with more will get more, the one with less will lose everything. It's always been a baffling saying, but linking it with this proverb here about using the wisdom that you've got to generate more wisdom. If you don't have any to start with, you're in trouble. So what exactly is it that we are not to give? Okay, so if you've got pure motives and you've got a good gift, there's still reasons to avoid giving. I think the answer is in the repetition of discernment that keeps popping up. So feral dogs, wild pigs, are thought of in the first century as undiscerning. So, they willingly eat other animals' feces. I mean, they're not the most discerning type of examples to use. So they're the examples of undiscernment. And this also reminds me of the sheep among wolves saying in Matthew 10:16, where Jesus says, "Be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." So to use wisdom for who's going to be able to anticipate what's going to happen if I share something really precious, really sacred. Is this the right audience, or is it going to make things worse? We've also got just the basic discernment of this is a proverb. How do I make sense of, it's not literal, it's metaphor. And then, so we're identifying what is it that's something holy. So in the literal level, it could be the temple or the temple food. But what are the sacred things, the pearls? In this context, I think it's likely to be wisdom, which could refer to Jesus' wisdom that he's giving in the Sermon on the Mount, or all of his teachings, or other scriptures. That the disciples are warned about being careful with, we don't just offer it out, think about some people might actually react with hostility, and be warned about that. So here I find we've got another column emerging that is similar. So far, both these proverbs have something reciprocal or loopy, cyclical. I was tempted to call this Jesus' loopy wisdom, but I thought maybe not. So, any questions for the second piece of wisdom?
I'm a little bit confused by this one. It seems to be saying that discern who you offer love to, who you offer Jesus' teaching to, and yet we're all children of God, and everybody deserves that. It sounds like you should be making an assessment about those who are likely to reject that teaching.
Yes, it does sound a little bit odd. Why wouldn't you be giving good things? I think it's designed to narrow it down to discernment. Like if you have something that you're giving that is advice for somebody. So I think it means if you're going to take a teaching of Jesus where it says, don't judge someone, and you're going to take that to somebody else. So Jesus says, don't judge. And it might not go well for certain audiences. So I think it's that kind of, because if we go too broad, it doesn't seem to make sense. But I think if we narrow it down to a certain kind of discernment, so it's discernment about discernment of offering discernment, if that makes sense.
I'd have to think about that too.
You're sounding loopy, Tim. I'm kind of reminded of when Jesus talks about spiritual milk, or, when Christians we talk about meat. So when it's time to feed a Christian spiritual milk as a new baby Christian, or when it's time to feed meat. Would that be a fair, is that?
Yeah, that is a little bit similar. For me, I'm thinking that I think this particular one was more intended for people who aren't fellow members of the community, because another thing is that dogs and pigs are they're not usually kept by Jews. So I think it could be that this is people who are outside the.
But even the dogs are
community.
worthy of the crumbs that fall from the master's table.
Yes, says a very smart person who's outside the community that Jesus is ministering to. Yeah.
Tricky.
So I think there is some similarity there because it's about the inappropriate. Like some things are just inappropriate at a certain time.
Yeah.
But I think that example was more about people like fellow believers.
Yeah.
And this seems to be more about people who aren't fellow believers. Yeah.
There's a Red Indian proverb many centuries later that says that when you cut down the last tree, then you realize that you cannot eat money. Might this proverb be like an early version or a precursor to that?
That's got a very similar feel, hasn't it? Where you've generated your own negative consequences. Yeah. There's quite a few similar kind of proverbs around. Yeah. Shall we? Another question?
Just puzzling about the identity of the pearls. I mean, do you want to be more? I mean, there's various, because it is a metaphor. I think I've heard any number of things being used to describe what the pearls are, or the treasure is. Any thoughts?
My first inclination is that pearls are anything that's extremely precious to someone. So whatever is precious to me. But I also do know that there are sayings from around this era where pearls were Torah teachings. So someone who's there's a rabbinic saying, I think, that where it refers to Torah pearls. So we don't really have enough information to know.
Sure. Yeah.
But I also think that it is expecting that each person figure out the appropriate interpretation for their situation, which I do think then helps me to think of, is there something that's precious to me that maybe I shouldn't share because it's going to be desecrated in some way, or there's going to be some hostility.
Oh, thank you.
Because trampling is often the word that's used for desecration.
Is this proverb sort of for a particular time? Obviously, when Jesus ascended, the disciples and apostles went out and cast their pearls everywhere. So is it only for this time when Jesus is doing his ministry?
That's a good question. I think that it does seem to fit even better as a temporary thing, where there might come a later time when they're more free to share everything. But I still do think that there's a general universal principle of, like, there are dangerous audiences that you do need to think about sharing things with. But yeah, I think it does seem to fit quite well as a temporary thing prior to the death and resurrection of Jesus. Yeah.
Thanks. Just really curious about the pearl bit, because there's nothing about pearls. It's not food. So if it had been don't make a feast and give it to pigs, right? But it's so
ridiculous. Why would someone try to feed pearls?
I mean, other things we've read during this conversation are things that, like milk and meat, you do feed those to people. But pearls are not food, so it really is curious, isn't it? What it's such a dramatic metaphor, because there's no circumstance that you would feed pearls to an animal, right?
Well, they do look like they are edible, and they are a natural seafood product.
It's very clever.
But yeah, I don't think any person in their right mind would ever think of you. It does seem quite inappropriate, which makes me think, is it deliberately chosen something that's completely inappropriate? Or is it... Well, actually, I don't know. I can't think of another option. It just seems really inappropriate.
I thought it was pearls of wisdom.
Yeah, pearls of wisdom. We have that that saying still. Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
just wondering about that, because in the first one, there was the ridiculousness of trying to take a speck with the big log. So is that part of his point? Or is that part of how we're supposed to understand the sort of situation, or part of the discerning, like that there's a huge mismatch between what
Yeah.
you're offering and who you're offering it to?
I think so. I think it's
Like the audience and the...
It could be that technique of make it so exaggerated and vivid that people will remember, oh, yeah, we know how that's ridiculous. And I think it helps people to take away something that sticks in their mind.
Yeah, so also I was wondering about the metaphor, the second half of it, so the trampling is rejection of what is offered, but it's not just a rejection, it's hostility, you were saying.
Yep.
And in that case, it's violent. Like how, I guess I'm wondering about, in terms of application, like how far are we to stretch that? Like, obviously it doesn't have to be literal, because this is a metaphor, but I don't know. Maybe it's not really a question you can answer, because you're saying it's about discernment for each situation.
Yeah, I think I see where you're heading. Like, does it have to be actual violence, or can it just be some other kind of hostility? And I think you've answered it with each person, I think, can answer it, can discern it for themselves. If there are no more questions, we'll keep
It
going.
could be just that the fact that the pigs completely lack discernment. Like if you scatter pearls before them, they will lack all discernment.
And try and eat them?
Well, they won't know if it's this or that.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean anything to them.
Yeah.
So, like we're talking about in the first scenario with the log in your eye, it's talking about being like assessing something, and then in this scenario, we're talking about throwing out something valuable, and pigs, they won't discern between that and rotten food or anything. They will just...
Does that suggest that we are becoming, if we did that, we would be like dogs and we would be like pigs, that would be undiscerning?
And we ourselves are becoming just as, lacking just as much discernment by throwing out something valuable as well.
Yeah.
Because it's something important, but we obviously aren't treasuring it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Shall we continue on? So the third piece of wisdom here: ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. Because everyone who asks receives, and who seeks finds, and for the one who knocks it will be opened. Is there any person here who, when his son asks for bread, would instead give him a stone, or asks for a fish, instead would give him a snake? So even though being evil to one another, you know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more so your Father in the heavens will give good things to those who ask him. So we've got three main parts. Something that's very straightforward, very logical. Well, apparently it is. Ask and it will be given to you. So this is very logical. And the second part is very illogical. This is not the consequence that will happen if a son asks a father for So presumably this is a young son who's dependent on the parent. And then the logical at the end. It makes it sound very easy. Why is it so simple? It sounds a little bit too simple. But some people might not know that they can ask. The creator of the universe, you can just ask the creator of the universe. Except if we step it back for a little bit and not go metaphorical, I don't see any reference to God in the first part. So we always assume that it's talking about prayer at the start. But that's turning it into a metaphor. But at the start, it wasn't necessarily. It was just literally talking about be someone who asks, be someone who seeks, be someone who knocks, because that's just the natural way that things work. If someone requests a meeting, the meeting happens. Someone who sets a goal, they pursues a goal, they'll achieve that particular goal. And if someone knocks on the door, most people wouldn't run away. They would open the door and talk to whoever's on the other side. So we started assuming that it was talking about prayer, but it's doing that pattern again, where it's talking about something ordinary, everyday wisdom. It's good to be someone who asks, good to be someone who seeks, good to be someone who knocks. Now, we've got a few perspectives here that we're being asked to notice. The first section to me seems like this is an adult with agency. And the second one seems to be a parent with a young dependent. So we're asked to think of ourselves as the parent. And then finally, to think of ourselves as the dependent. So why is it so simple? What is it that's assumed, that's asked in each of these cases? Asked, sought for, knocked on. What is it that's being knocked on? Like if we're thinking about the metaphor, we might think, oh, well, it can mean anything. Maybe it means possessions, although 8 verses ago it said don't pursue those things. Seek first the kingdom. So it's probably not talking about possessions. What is it that it's talking about? Well, if we think about the pattern that we've been encountering so far, the first one, what was the theme? Becoming self-aware, discerning your own issue. Here's a proverb that has a similar pattern to it. Indeed, if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, if you look for it as for silver and search for it as a hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. Proverbs 8:17, I, wisdom, love my lovers. Those who seek me shall find me. So I think that it's talking about pursuing wisdom. So if we look at our table now, this one has also cause and effect. The negative consequences were the illogical part. If you ask, there's not going to be negative consequences. You mean I can ask the creator of the universe? There's not a whole lot of bureaucracy to get through. You can just ask. Am I going to get in trouble for asking? No, there's no negative consequences. So we had something given. reference to someone giving, something given, something receiving. We have different perspectives that we're asked to imagine. It was using the everyday wisdom of a parent-child relationship to extrapolate on. This means that it could also be something to do with reciprocal action or loops, perhaps, if we're following the same pattern. But where's the loop here? Where's the reciprocal action in this ask, seek, knock saying? Well, I think that the answer is in the dependency part. If you're in a situation where you don't have something and you need it, then and if the topic is wisdom, you need some discernment for a situation, then how do you use everyday wisdom if you just don't have a similar piece of wisdom that you can use? So how do you get into a wisdom loop? So the dependency theme suggests that the person who is seeking cannot see a way into a wisdom loop using their everyday wisdom. Perhaps this is why there are older proverbs that say that the way into wisdom is to recognise our deep dependency of and reverence of God. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. The fear of the Lord is instruction in wisdom, and humility comes before honour. So this one also seems to be talking about discernment and wisdom. Don't be afraid to ask for discernment. If you've identified that you lack wisdom in this case, this particular case that you need discernment for, you are already getting into a wisdom loop by asking. Let's have some questions. Have I convinced people that it's talking about wisdom?
So to use your own question, you said, like, it doesn't say it's God. So why are we assuming we're asking God?
At the end of it, it talks about God at the end. So I think we're expected to link it with the beginning. So
okay. Can you go back?
Go back to... So,
oh, yeah, okay.
So as the conclusion, we get the idea that, oh, it is talking about asking for something heavenly, something from God.
Yeah, good, thanks.
More a comment than a question. I guess I liken it to, going to a situation where you don't know what to say or what to do, and just asking God for the words to say. Just asking for His wisdom when you don't have the wisdom. So, yeah, more a comment than a question.
Yes.
I don't know if it's off topic, but having that childlike faith. So, talking about a father and a child and being humble and, childlike. Humbling yourself before the Father like a child.
Again, not necessarily a question, but just thinking back to what you were saying about masks with the critic, and that we've got our own mask on, and it's not until we take off our mask and realise our real state. And I kind of see that in here too, of realising that we are dependent, that we we have agency, but we are also dependent.
Yes.
There's no real question, but I don't know, thoughts coming together.
Yeah, I like that there's the combination of the dependency, how am I going to, there's a new situation, I've got no idea what am I supposed to do in this situation. I recognise my complete inadequacy and dependency on God, and in doing so, that is using my own discernment, because there's probably another proverb that mentions the foolish person who doesn't do that. So this is why I think that it's about you have the power to get into a wisdom loop by recognising your powerlessness, if that makes sense.
Well, even that poll was a lack of wisdom, but
Say that again.
That telephone pole, that plank in your own eye, that lack of wisdom, that we barrel in and do things and we hurt people in the process, and until you can deal with, I don't have the wisdom here that I need. Yeah, as I said, no question, just thoughts bubbling.
Okay, I do have a question. I'm looking at the bread and fish in this section and thinking back to the holy things and the pearls of the previous one, and wondering if you can see any reason for consumables, perishables in this one versus lasting things, perhaps in the previous section.
That's a good point. These ones are more temporary, daily things, which I think connects with the customised aspect of what you need for that particular situation at that particular time, which reminds me of the Lord's Prayer about asking for the day's bread. Just what is it at this particular moment? You're not asking for lots of other future moments. Just that case. Yeah.
So I thought about the Lord's Prayer just as you said, the Lord's Prayer. So do you think these, from Matthew 6, where he's given that formula of the Lord's Prayer, and then he goes on with all these other things, are they unpacking ideas contained within the Lord's Prayer? Like, is there...
Possibly. I haven't really looked into... I know that I found some links between the Lord's Prayer and the good eye, bad eye, to do with willing to be happy for someone else, to see someone else receive good things, which I thought was linked with the Lord's Prayer's emphasis on forgiving debts. But I think the Bible Project might link it with some other passage. It might be one of these passages, but I'm not sure.
Any thoughts on the evil bit in the end there?
Yes, in this time I've translated it as being evil to one another, and I think it's a reference to humans don't have a good track record for all kinds of relationships, be it international relationships, slave owner relationships, marriage relationships, any kind of relationship you can think of. Humans have not a very good track record of...
He went from slaves to marriage. That was a little too quick for me.
So any kind of relationships, not a good track record. So I think it's a reference to, if you can think of, is there a good example, like Jesus is trying to think, is there a good example that I can think of? And he thinks of a dependent child, and says, who wouldn't want to give good gifts to to their little child. So I think that it's contrasting, trying to think of, this is a really good example of a relationship where you really do want good for the other person, and how much more, how God's even better than that, even better than the best relationship you can think of. Yeah. So I don't think it means, I don't think Jesus is saying, I think you're evil. You don't think he's looking at people saying, I think you're evil. If he's looking at someone here, it would be the two sets of brothers that have come to be taught, Peter, Andrew, James and John, and he's saying to them, well, which one of you would do that for your own son? You know, even though you are evil, I think means, the track record of humans don't tend to want good things for other people. But here's an example where it's much pure. Like, we can easily say, oh, look at that, that's a pure example where you really just want pure good for the other person, opposed to, like, there's lots of other examples where you probably wouldn't work. It would be harder to find a good example. I don't know if that really makes the passage completely readable, but that's how I interpret it.
Just a very quick comment. Is evil our sinful nature?
No, I think it's to do with the relationships because of the emphasis here on relational wisdom.
Which causes our relationship breakdown, our sinful nature.
I think here it's a reference to relationships, thinking of relationships. I'm not sure how to get more out of it, without sort of straying completely from the text.
Yeah.
And we've got another one to go. If there aren't any more questions, I've got another question.
Just a comment and a question. I think just on Jen's question, I think the being evil, it's an observed thing. So it's about observing behaviour, right? That's behaviour which is fairly observable versus our nature, which is not observable. But I was thinking about the giving thing. In the previous bit, I'm still worried about the pigs and the dogs. I might leave some sleep tonight, I think. But I think the thing is, we often, in our interpretive turn in that passage, we focus it on, our focus is on pigs and dogs, and they're actually the problem, right? They're the ones who are going to waste the valuable thing. But I think can we not look at it in the same as this, perhaps, in this space, where it's about being responsible for what you give?
Yeah, I think Jesus is putting the responsibility on to the person who's giving.
Yeah. So just like you wouldn't give a pearl to my dog, but you wouldn't give her a stone if she's hungry either, right? So rather than, we tend to focus a lot, as I'm saying, about how we worry about who the pigs are. We want to identify the pigs or the dogs, but I suspect that's not the point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yes, well said. Let's do the final piece of wisdom. So then, the things that you want other people to do to you, do those same things to them, because that is the law and the prophets. I have a question. Does it mean treat others the way you like to be treated? Because I suspect that on a literal level, that's exactly what it's saying. You treat others the way you want to be treated, and then others are going to treat you the way you want to treat it, it's going to be getting into this reciprocal thing again, which is taking us full circle back to where we started. But what about for someone who likes to argue all the time, or someone who likes to be bossed around? Does that mean that they have permission to treat others the way they want to be treated? So it seems like, well, that can't be right. But if we're looking at the pattern, I think the answer is here in looking at the pattern with the first, second and third pieces of wisdom. In the first case, we have becoming aware of oneself and aware of what one looks like from another person's perspective. And then building on this of perspective and discernment, the second piece of wisdom is about being aware of what you are giving and what the other person might do with it and to you. And the third piece of wisdom, imagining more perspectives and imagining your role is reversed. So now you are the potential recipient rather than the giver. So I think if we combine all this together, which I think it is building to this concluding fourth one, which means that the fourth piece of wisdom includes self-awareness, self-understanding, able to reverse the roles and imagine not only their own perspective, but imagine you're asked to imagine that you were the other person. So do what you would want to be done to you if you were them. So if we're tracking the table of linkages here, we can see, yes, we've got cause and effect, and avoiding the negative consequences is implied because you're now creating, you're being the kind of, you're going to be treated better because you're treating others better. Like you're getting into that's implied, even though it doesn't express it literally. It refers to something being, you have a giver and a receiver. Imagining different perspectives is implied. It is using something that is very easy to understand and making it broader. And there's the reciprocity and loops. So the final part where it says, this is the law and the prophets. What do people think of that? Does that ring true, that this is the law and the prophets? How accurate is it, would we say? Do to others what you would want done to you. That's the law and the prophets. So I think that as a summary, a better summary of the law and the prophets would be Moses led us out of Egypt to be God's special people so that we would be a light to the Gentile nations, but the prophets kept reminding us that we are not yet doing this very well because we keep on behaving just like the nations. So in terms of summarizing all the law and the prophets, because in Matthew, law and the prophets means all the previous scriptures. It's not a very good summary. Like, is it a good summary? I don't know. Is it the goal of the scriptures? Perhaps reading between the lines of the scriptures. Is it a distillation? So after many years of studying the scriptures, getting to the essence of the scriptures, perhaps. Or is it Jesus' interpretation? That this is the easiest way of reading it, is Jesus' interpretation. But I actually do think that it might be all of the above. Because if we think of the theme here of reciprocal relationships and loops and discernment and about humankind trying to get out of bad cycles, well, the scriptures are repeatedly referring to cycles of behaviour individual and especially collective human behaviour. Biblical Israel often finds itself in a bad cycle. The question of how ancient Israelites are to get out of a vicious cycle and into a virtuous cycle is reasonably adequate as a summary, goal, essence, and interpretation of the law and the prophets. So as a group, I find that these are Jesus' wise sayings intended to make us wiser. And so the key questions that we use for studying these 4 pieces of wisdom is looking at who is doing the judging in the first case. In the second case, how do we know what we're being advised to do? How do we apply a piece of veterinarian advice? So that the challenge is to use discernment to get more discernment. In the third case, what we're encouraged to seek is to ask God for discernment. And in the fourth case, the question, does it mean treat others the way we would like to be treated? I think if we see it as the concluding one, then it takes it even further. And it says, imagine that the roles were reversed. So I was using these 4 questions to help identify the difficult aspects. I mean, there are other more difficult theological aspects, which, because I'm not a theologian, I'm not trying to necessarily unpack all the difficult theology, but by looking at these 4 questions, it does help, I think, get us deeper into the text and to see the linkages across all four wisdom sayings. So we've got time for questions on the fourth one or all 4.
So for the fourth one, because this is the law and the prophets, I mean, the law and how we treat other people, how we love people, is obviously a big part of that, but also how we love God. So it doesn't actually say that's the summary of the law of the prophets. This is the law and the prophets. So there's more to it than that, though. There's how we love God as well. Is that how you see it?
It also depends whether you think that the law and the prophets contain everything about how we love each other and God as well, I suppose, because you can just keep going broader and say that there are other ways of knowing God from everyday wisdom. So here we've got a lot of everyday wisdom that's being used, and I find it fascinating that it's assumed that we can, in the fourth case, we can imagine what the other person, we're expected to be able to understand what the other person would want if we were in their shoes, which comes from our own wisdom as well. Obviously, it includes asking God to help us if we don't know, and the wisdom of knowing what you don't know as well. But back to your question, are you asking that the law and the prophets are... Can you say your question
I'm just
again?
curious about the screen that came up with the fourth one. is this a reasonable, what was something about, is this an accurate, how did you say it? Is this an accurate summary of the law and the prophets? And I'm just curious about, I mean, in part, yes, but it doesn't talk about the loving God part, that's all. Just curious about what you think about that. I mean, it really does matter how we treat other people. Like, it's incredibly important. And it, but as a distillation, is it are you seeing it as a distillation of the entirety, or a distillation as in part, this is the law and the prophets?
I was saying that the easiest way of reading it is it's an interpretation of the law and the prophets.
Yeah, cool.
But I was also thinking that some of these other things might also work more than what we think. So summary doesn't seem to work very well, but taking into consideration the loops that are in scriptures.
And this is not a question, it's a comment. I just love, it's blindingly obvious to me as a spiritual formation person. There's so much here about self-awareness, and without awareness, there's very little movement we can make in the spiritual life, right? And I love, it's just so powerful to have these four together and to notice that a major theme is know yourself, right? And of course, a lot of our great Christian writers over time, knowing yourself, knowing God, same journey. So yeah, just very impacting to have the four together like this. Thank you very much.
I'm curious about the first one, don't judge, and how it corresponds with the law and the prophets, because they were clearly criticising the community of Israel and beyond. And like, to me, when I read this, it's a cause and effect. It's not necessarily don't do this, just be aware that if you do this, there will be consequences, which is slightly different. So yeah, don't judge. Well, yeah, that's actually an instruction. But then it also says, but if you judge, you will be judged by that amount.
Yeah.
So like, I'm thinking of like John the Baptist, and then all of the prior prophets in the Old Testament. Can you just speak to the law and the prophets in that sense?
So the prophets who were giving judgments. Yeah. Does that perhaps mean that to be a prophet, you have to be willing to be judged more strictly? So the things that you're calling out as a prophet, if you're a prophet calling out a particular thing, you don't want to have that particular problem in your own life. And I guess that God wouldn't call you to be a prophet of that particular thing.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering if that kind of connects with someone like Isaiah, you know, how he says, like, woe to me, I'm a man of unclean lips, and then God deals with that first, you know, to give by sanctifying him before he's commissioned, perhaps.
Yeah, so the level of purity or something that is required in that role is taken quite seriously. Yeah.
That's true. Thank you for that comment, because I'm just thinking also about Jonah, and God deals with Jonah's inner issues as well, with love and who's precious in the plant, and is it really that bad? You know, the inner work. And
yeah.
I'd love to read a doctorate on God's working with people's inner lives, who are the judges.
Yeah.
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 That just reminded me as well with we just studied Jeremiah at church and all, I mean, thinking about rejection and hostility, like the prophets were attacked. And Jesus talks about, he talks about the Pharisees' ancestors, you killed all of the prophets that came before.
Yeah.
And they were brought low by God, and not in a negative sense, but like Ezekiel, it was not an easy occupation, and they were attacked for it, and put to death. So I guess he's saying, if you're going to judge, well, sorry, not that one, the second one, so I guess don't presume to be a prophet too quickly. I don't know.
Were the prophets throwing their pearls to swine? To the Pharisees.
Did you want to say something?
I'm just thinking about what Jack said. Is this Jesus saying don't do? I don't feel like they're commands, like they're proverbs, and it's like it's a warning. It's wisdom. So if you're going to do this, then these are the consequences. It's not a straight out prohibition so much.
Yeah.
Does that?
Yeah, it does seem like it's like a wise saying intended to increase wisdom, and you could interpret it the way that you think. Well, maybe a future generation will hear me, and I'll happy to be killed in the current generation.
Just looking at the four of them next to each other like that, I've noticed the variation in length. You've got a long, deeply explored thing, and then a brief, figure it out yourself kind of thing.
Yeah.
Do you think there's something going on with how much time Jesus spends explaining each of the four?
Yeah, I think that the length is related to the kind of discernment. So the short ones require more discernment to know exactly how to implement it, and the longer ones, there's more helpful clues about how to interpret it. Does that answer? Can't remember the question. Yeah, long, short.
Only because they're next to each other. I
Yeah.
don't miss it as much as
Matthew likes patterns.
So does you. So do you.
Yeah.
I don't have a question, but Dave Nichols has a question. Actually, I've got questions too, but we'll do Dave's first. Dave Nichols online. Spiritual discernment is usually associated with knowing the mind of Christ in a particular situation. Is this kind of discernment... I've just got something there on my screen. Is this the kind of discernment this is talking about? Or is it the more general sense of wisdom, regularly making wise judgments?
I see a lot of general everyday wisdom being used, and there's not a lot of emphasis on wisdom that comes from God, except for the third one, which assumes that there is a deficiency of everyday wisdom to to help, because you're so dependent and you just don't have the capacity. So I don't really see much overlap with, like a theologian would talk about the mind of Christ. This seems very earthy, these proverbs. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the...
Well, then he has two questions. Another question. It is said that all major religions have a version of the Golden Rule. And this is a vote, perhaps, for kind of universalism. Do you think this is putting a new, perhaps deeper insight to the rule because of its placement in the text, perhaps challenging or requiring more than popular wisdom?
Yes, I think that this... that it is true that this saying appears in other religions fairly similarly across other religions. The fourth saying, and yes, I do think that putting it into context changes the meaning to be more about thinking about what the other person actually needs, because of the emphasis on shifting perspectives. How can you imagine being in their shoes? So I do feel like that this one, I mean, I haven't studied the other parallels from other religions, so I probably don't know that if I can talk about those ones.
I'm really enjoying the shifting perspectives space and looking at it the way that Jesus is treating us. It feels like Jesus is shifting perspectives with how we might hear this and what we might do from our shoes. And so depending on where we're at, taking that concept with what we were talking about before, yes, it says don't judge. So if you're at the concrete level of that's all you need, don't judge, like a child, just don't do that, then that's fine for that dependent child space. But if you're an adult to adult space, the ask, seek and knock, or the one who's an adult giving to a child, there's more complexity to it. So Jesus speaks to that stage of spiritual development, to say, okay, for those people who need a simple rule, don't do it. That's enough for you. But if you are going to actually be mature and think about doing this, then these are the guidelines. It sort of reminds me of how we do treat very sacred things, like just don't have sex. But if you are going to, because these are the circumstances to do it in, and this is what's required, and this is the consequence. And it just reminds me of all the time Jesus is working at so many levels, putting himself in our space and saying, for some of you it's going to be a simple thing, but for others of you it's going to be more complex. And I'm prepared to give you an answer that will meet you wherever you are on the simple to complex range of ways of taking this. And that's what requires the discernment.
Mm.
I like the loopy thinking. I can do loopy thinking. But just kind of looping back from, so then this is the behaviour or the action that you want, to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and to think about how you would want to be. So going back then and looking at the beginning, how do I do that? I don't do that by judging them and saying, you've got the problem, I'll fix it for you. And you don't do it by giving them unsolicited advice and here's what I think you should do. You do it by asking, this happened, what did you think? Did you mean what I think I heard you mean? Or seeking, seeking to understand a situation or what's going on. because in this way I can put myself in your shoes and then react and respond. I don't know. Am I being loopy?
I like loopy.
I like practical.
Thank you for the lectures and the very clear tabling about what is being loopy. And I just refer back, chapter 8, first verse of Matthew, where it says, then Jesus leave the cloud and come down from the mountain. And then in chapter 7, 9, and you quoted also about the Father giving the Son something. Well, in your translation it says, "Who are you here? Among you here will be a bad father that behaves that way." Obviously, the whole segment is related or centered in the teaching on the Mount, and I just wonder whether putting back this context will add any things to what you have just said, or weaken your argument, or strengthen your argument, or deepen it in any way. Thank you.
Yeah. So, so these four, if we read them in the context of the Sermon on the Mount, I tend to read the Sermon on the Mount as a masterclass for the 4 disciples that have been chosen so far. So just before the sermon, Jesus chose 2 sets of brothers. So I read the Sermon on the Mount as it's saying that those 2 sets of brothers are being given a class by Jesus, and the crowds are watching. So that's why we got a lot of brother language and father-son language. So Jesus is teaching Peter, Andrew, James and John. But of course the crowds can listen in. But we don't have any questions and answers, so it's more like a lecture. And yeah, I'd still like to do more work on the sermon as a whole to better answer that question, as when we put this in the context of the Sermon on the Mount. Are there other changes? Because there's probably things that I've missed, because I'm concentrating today just on this group, and there could be more connections that emerge. Yeah.
Maybe this is getting off topic. So just on what you said, where do you think we're supposed to position ourselves when we read to the Sermon on the Mount? If this is a masterclass for those 4, and
Yeah, I suppose we could imagine either being in the crowd or being one of the 4 disciples so far that are there. Or just treat it as a written text and treat ourselves as a reader. I think there's so many different options. So yeah, I don't have a definite one. Yeah.
Sorry, there's a question from David, but I was just thinking along a similar line. So we talk about this typically from individual perspectives. So we tend to think of it as all the yous must be singular. But does it seem that there is an organisational or corporate angle as well? How organisations behave, how communities behave. Perhaps more than a compilation of individual perspectives, but how an organisation, and I'll say community, how does that deal with judging and discernment?
Yeah.
Thoughts?
That's a good question. I haven't thought very much about how to read it as it's speaking to a group. But if we do think of it as if Jesus is saying to a particular organisation or a particular group, don't criticise another organisation. I suppose that we could. That's yeah. I probably should go back now and I really think about.
Yes, please.
How to read that way.
And even if this is say to the Matthean community, or to a community, then does it change then perhaps even how we who we decide the dogs and the pigs are, rather than being them who are outside the gates?
Yes. So
right? It's a very different posture then, isn't it?
Yeah. So if it's no longer individual, and we're thinking of you as a group. Because that means the group needs to act together and decide on what is the process for officially going to another group or interacting with other groups. Yeah,
which brings in kind of group or community discernment. What does organisational discernment look like?
Yeah.
Gain wisdom and understanding. Yeah, I would think gain wisdom and understanding. Within organisations.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about this last one along those lines that, I mean, it's hard for us to, well, we usually assume that other people want to be treated the way that we want to be treated. So it takes quite a lot of self-awareness, but also discernment and knowledge of others to get into their shoes and imagine how they want to be treated. So if we're thinking corporately, that's talking about cross-cultural intelligence as well, that we actually, we can't assume that other organisations we partner with across cultures or even in the same culture are like us and want to be treated the way that we assume everyone wants to be treated.
Yeah.
So there's a lot, like, to me it just seems like there's a lot of work implied in that on an individual level, but then also cross-culturally across organisations, because we don't know what we don't know. We don't know how. Yeah, we can't assume. Anyway, that's just a comment.
Yeah. Gone quite well over time.
Lots more thinking now. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, community here and online who've been involved and participated and asked good questions and provoked this good man further. We'll get some answers out of you eventually. No, this is marvellous. So thank you very much, Tim, again for sharing your work. So much work has gone into this, and it's great to be part of the conversation. Yeah, clapping is now. So thank you for attending. Thank you, Zoom friends, for hanging in there in Zoom and participating. It's been great to have you with us. Bless you all as you go. Thank you.